Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. It's been a little while since we've had an episode. Fortunately, this year we got a little bit further, and we are going to dive into our next topic, which is the Great Depression and the New Deal. So, what we're looking at here is a great transition from where we left off, which is World War I. Now, I don't have any videos up of the 1920s. More to come probably a little bit later, but we will definitely talk about the 20s in this unit and certainly kind of give ourselves a highlight here. But this photograph is a really great example of a transition because we're going to learn about something today called the Bonus Army, which is a series of World War I veterans who were promised a pension, and they're not supposed to get it till 1945, but they're going to call on it to get it early due to their financial situation. So we're looking here at a great example of people buying stocks and definitely looking at a stock exchange and a stock for the beginnings of the stock market. So we're going to be able to describe first how the stock market crash in 1929 essentially signals the end of the prosperity of the 1920s. And here's kind of where we'll lay a little bit of background, even though we've skipped some parts of the 1920s. But you would have seen certainly headlines like this from the New York Times. Certainly, you've also got the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and certainly the Wilkes-Barre Record, too, certainly gives you a little bit, and this is, again, coming out of Pennsylvania, just gives you a little bit of sense of the time period and some of the fear that came with that event. Now, we talked a lot about in the 1920s that there's this sense of prosperity. People, you see a developing middle class, you see certainly the upper echelons, the more wealthy, certainly have a tremendous time period of economic growth. And a lot of that is through this kind of economic prosperity that we saw, especially with more people buying things on the stock exchange, aka the stock market. But this is an organized system for buying and essentially selling shares, particularly shares of corporations, which again we talked about a little bit more about certainly back in the Gilded Age. But again, a very organized system. And a lot of people were doing very well in the 1920s. And the 20s are marked by not just this time period of prosperity, but also emerging American culture, whether it's jazz or baseball. It was really a time period in which even the Harlem Renaissance, you saw the expansion of American culture, not just within the country, but to the rest of the world, especially with the Harlem Renaissance, when it comes to the many African-American writers who gained notoriety through that time period. But what you see is this rising prices of stock in the late 20s. It had really encouraged more and more Americans to be a little bit more risky when it comes to buying stocks. So you see a lot of what we call buying on the margin or buying shares on the margin. And this is essentially when you pay only a fraction of the stock price. So basically, you pay a small amount that the stock is worth, and then you borrow the rest from a broker with the idea that you'll pay back what you owe with the interest that you make or the extra money that you make on the stocks. And this can work if the stock grows, but the issue is that if the stock doesn't grow or the value decreases, not only have you lost your initial investment, now you owe the broker money too. And so with fears that this boom market was going to come to an end, investors really began selling back stocks in late September, and some people going as far as taking their money out of stock in banks, which causes a panic. And so prices are going to see this really sharp decline, and this is going to panic a lot of traders who sold something upwards of 13 million shares on October 24th in 1929. And this is a day that becomes known as Black Thursday in American history and causes an economic panic. One thing that we certainly want to highlight and overview about the Great Depression is this concept of high unemployment. And we're going to use this word economic depression a lot, and we're going to kind of highlight it. But it is different than a recession. It's more extreme. It's more severe. And so you just take a look at our chart here and look at the total number available to work versus the total employed. And you're going to see from 29 to 30, 31, 32, 33, The total number employed, with the exception of 32 to 33, is declining every year. And the total number available to work is increasing. Again, you don't see much change between 31 and 32. But again, we're talking about people who are 14 and older and available to work. A couple of other ways to look at this. We got a line graph that again shows that steady increase in the total available to work. And again, the kind of pink and purple color depicting that steady decline. And again, between 32 and 33, you see it kind of level out a little bit. And we'll highlight the numbers later in the Great Depression as we get there, certainly in connection with the New Deal. Just a bar graph to kind of depicting the same thing, but depending on how you want to visualize it, one of these might be more helpful than the other. And usually what I have students do in class is recreate this either through that line graph or through a bar graph, whichever is more helpful to them. We're also going to be able to explain how the Great Depression, which again is a worldwide event. I don't want you to get this idea that this is purely an American experience. In fact, Europe goes through an economic depression almost immediately after World War I. And so the fact that it's coming to the United States is not something that is unique. It's definitely a worldwide economic slump. And it brought a lot of hardship to many Americans in the 1930s. And we're going to highlight some of those. So again, we're going to use this word, the Great Depression, a lot. And again, the difference between a depression and a recession, which many of you have probably lived through, is that they typically are more severe. And they usually last longer than recessions do. But they're essentially, this is a severe economic crisis that starts in the late 1920s, 1928, 1929. Although you're starting to see things occurring before that. And so it's important to keep in mind that while the stock market crash has a huge effect on the United States, it's not the only cause of this time period that we call the Great Depression. So here are a couple of the other ones. Unfortunately, throughout the 1920s, we saw this steady decline of farm income dropping, which definitely is hurting, especially the economies in places like the West. You're also seeing in that industrial side, you're seeing automobiles and construction industries also experiencing lagging sales. And when you have those lagging sales, you can't afford to keep all of your workforce. And so many workers were getting laid off. That was already adding to the pool of people who were unemployed before the stock market crash. You were also seeing that small banks were suffering as farmers began to default on their loans. And now when you default on something, that means that you failed to meet an obligation. So in this case, this is a financial one. You took out a loan, but you couldn't afford to pay it back. And then you have to give up your collateral. Anytime you give out a loan, there is some sort of collateral. If you can't pay it, the bank gets this in exchange for you not being able to make that payment. Whether it's a car loan and then the bank gets your car if you can't afford it, or your house or what have you. But in this case, this is really hurting small banks because small banks make their money by lending out money, and that's how they make money, is on the interest. And so when farmers can't pay back those loans, and with fewer people able to get loans, it hurts the bank's money too. You also had some large banks beginning to collapse and definitely suffering huge losses from the stock market, including a lot of people taking out their stock in the bank itself. You're also definitely seeing increased tariffs, and with fewer loans for American banks, overall foreign companies and countries are not purchasing as many American goods. And this, of course, means less money for American companies and less money for the economy. It means less money not only is coming from consumers in the United States, it means less money coming from consumers outside of the United States. And unfortunately, during the Great Depression, millions of people are going to lose their jobs, and many more people who do have a job see their wages reduced. And so it becomes a way of trying to, whatever you have, make it last as long as possible, because you don't know when more is coming, whether that's food, clothing, in some cases, having to recreate your shelter. And again, Hoovervilles are going to be a great example of that. Many people are living in these shelters that are built out from old boxes or from reclaimed wood or scrap metal. And these are communities that begin to be known as Hoovervilles, which of course are named for the president of the time, Herbert Hoover. Great example of one right here. And you can certainly see from these pictures that you're seeing stoves kind of in the foreground here where, people would be making their meals. You're seeing even old picture frames, helping to serve as siding or wood. And so you're essentially seeing anything that can be used to provide shelter in some of these Hoovervilles is being utilized. And certainly, people living wherever they can, inside cities or outside of cities. And again, you're seeing, young families being affected by this as well. So small children growing up in this lifestyle. So quick check-in question here. What hardship did more than 25% of Americans face during the Great Depression? Pause the video if you need to, but we're certainly going to keep moving. So we've got A, inflation, B, unemployment, C, scarcity of goods, or D, high stock prices. And so this number is referring to the number of unemployed. Now, one thing I want to note about this number, one thing I'll talk more about in my class too, is the idea that this is the average for all Americans. This number becomes much higher when we talk about groups like African Americans. The Great Depression hits people differently, and it hits African Americans and other communities, minority communities, much, much harder. So again, this number is an average for all American people. Now, we've mentioned his name a few times, so it's certainly worth talking about our 31st president, Herbert Hoover. He's going to serve from his presidency from 1929 to 1933, and so very quickly, in his first year as president, boom, stock market crash. He's going to get a lot of criticism for how he handles it. Truth be told, I don't know if Hoover could have done necessarily anything to stop the Great Depression dead in its tracks. Could he have done more to slow it down? Maybe. But he certainly is a president who, whether it's Harding or Coolidge or Hoover, you see kind of this transition in the Republican Party from one that's, pushing for things like during the progressive era and economic change to a little bit more conservatism. And you're starting to see that shift in this time period. But we're going to explain how Hoover gradually changes his tactics and he starts to involve more of the federal government in addressing this economic crisis. And what I mean by eventually is that initially Hoover and Congress didn't really take any legislative action to help the Great Depression, and really called on more private industry. He called on charities. He called on churches and volunteers to help provide relief for those who are in need. And so it's a very hands-off approach. It's a little bit more of a conservative approach. And while this approach perhaps could have worked, part of the struggle too is not quite, in Hoover's case, understanding the full magnitude of what was happening. And so in 1931, Hoover's going to start to change. And he knows that the government needs to get a little bit more involved because it's just too big for charities, churches, and volunteers to fix the issue. So in 1931, he's authorizing federal spending on public works. So these are projects like highways and parks, libraries, in order to basically build these with public funds for public use. You're going to see his predecessor, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, takes this to a whole new level with the New Deal. But you're going to see between Hoover and FDR a really big change in the approach. And Hoover kind of does change his tactics, but for the American people, perhaps he changed it a little too late. So in late 1932, veterans of World War I, who again are going to be known as the Bonus Army, they're going to march on D.C. And having served in World War I, they are entitled to a pension. And this was something that was promised to them by the federal government while Wilson was president. However, This wasn't supposed to be paid until 1945. And for people who are thinking, well, that in our history would be the end of World War II. We didn't know World War II was coming at the time. But with such economic demand, they wanted those payments early. And again, they weren't supposed to be scheduled to be paid to them until 1945. But there was just so much need for veterans at the time period that they were calling to get that payment early. And so that's the photograph that we started off with today. That was the Bonus Army meeting to prepare to march on D.C. and to try to put pressure on D.C. to make some changes. Now, President Hoover at the time, he's calling on the Army to come in to try to kind of settle things. And after a few scuffles broke out, 2 veterans from the Bonus Army were killed. And so certainly this does not help Hoover's image, who is already becoming less popular with, of course, the situation that he ends up being dealt as president. So when you think about this, the Bonus Army was comprised of veterans from a war. And again, pause if you need to here, but we're going to keep going. Letter A is the Revolutionary War. Probably a little bit too far back. Letter B is the Civil War. C, Spanish-American War, or D, World War I. So again, pause if you need to, but we're going to keep moving. These, the members of the Bonus Army are veterans of World War I. So that's going to mark the end of our video. For my students, I highly encourage you to check out this review. I can certainly help you out as far as checking your answers, but certainly look back in through here as well. Certainly, we didn't mention Hawley Smoot tariff by name today, but you can get certainly a good sense of how those tariffs hurt American business as far as investment. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense in its effect on the economy. So I want to thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History.